Hello, this is a short lecture on plate tectonics. The Earth's crust and upper mantle are broken down to sections called plates. These plates float on the mantle much like a raft would float on water. The reason for that is because the plates have a lower density than the mantle. At the bottom of the lithosphere is what is called the asthenosphere. This is a layer that is considered weak rock and can flow much like silly putty. This silly putty is going to flow in a convection cell that's going to move our plates. Here's a common example of convection. Old houses tend to have radiators near their windows as a form of heat. The hot water is going to travel through the radiator, and that's going to heat up the air next to it. The air is going to become less dense and it's going to rise to the ceiling. As it cools, because now it's away from the radiator, it is going to become more dense and sink on the other side of the room. So this creates a convection cell that circulates the heat throughout the room. Convection cells is a cycle of heating material becoming less dense, causing it to rise. Then the material cools, becomes more dense, and sinks. The Earth has a hot inner core, heating up this plastic-like rock in the asthenosphere. This is going to create convection cells. As convection cells move horizontally underneath the plates, this is going to create a lot of friction and it's going to drag the plate along with it. These convection cells occur in the mantle and the asthenosphere. The hot core is going to cause the mantle to become less dense and rise up. Then it will move horizontally underneath the plate, and that's going to drag the plate along with it. Then it will sink, becoming cooler and more dense, and that's going to cause the plate to sink down. Now that it's near the core, it's going to heat up again and rise, and the cycle will start all over again. So plates again, these are large sections of the lithosphere that float on top of the asthenosphere. There are two types of plates. We have the oceanic plate and the continental plate. Oceanic plates are very thin compared to continental plates and very dense because they're made from a rock basalt, which has a high density. Continental plates, however, they're very thick, but they have a lower density because their rock is mostly consists of silicon, which is less dense than basalt. So let's take a look at the two different types of crust. Here's our oceanic crust. It has a very high density, so it's sitting below the water because it's sinking lower down into the mantle. And continental crust over here has a much thicker depth, and it is a lower density, so it's actually sitting higher. Okay, so now our plates we talked about are moving. If they're moving on the Earth, they're going to hit each other. They're going to come together, they're going to go apart, they're going to slide past each other. So we have three main types of plate boundaries. We have a transform boundary. That's where plates slide past each other horizontally. They'll get stuck and they're going to eventually break and form earthquakes. Convergent boundaries, these are where plates are coming together. There are different types of convergent boundaries, so we'll get into that in a minute. And last, we have divergent boundaries, and that's where plates are separating away from each other. At transform boundaries, we have, again, two plates sliding past each other in opposite directions, or they could go in the same direction, but one's moving faster. So think of cars traveling on a highway. If one car is moving faster than another car in the same direction, they'll still pass each other. Transform boundaries have a lot of earthquakes. A good example is the San Andreas Fault. This is where the Pacific plate is sliding past the North American plate. This kind of plate boundary will create strike-slip faults. These faults are smaller pieces of the rock that break. The rocks sliding past each other will stick together, but eventually it's going to break, and that's going to release a lot of energy, creating the earthquakes. So highlighted in red is the transform boundary. Los Angeles is moving at a faster rate, sort of northwest, than California is. Divergent plate boundaries are where two plates are moving apart from each other. Di means two, so they're moving in two pieces away from each other. An example, we have mid-ocean ridges throughout the ocean. One specific example is the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. This one is in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. Another example is the Great African Rift Valley. That is where Africa is beginning to separate. At divergent boundaries, we'll get minor earthquakes, but not big ones. The big thing we're going to get here are volcanoes. The volcanoes are going to form, and they're going to generate brand new oceanic crust. These are images of a divergent boundary in Africa. You can see two parts where it's trying to separate. At divergent boundaries, we get tensional forces. Tension forces pull rocks away from each other. We also get fault blocks, which is when the rocks are tilt or slide down to form fault block mountains. So these rocks, at one point, the lines you can see used to all be together, but now they are broken and they slid down. Rift valleys will form when the divergence causes separation. A rift valley is a section of the rock that drops downward to form a big valley. As a continent gets pulled apart, we will get cracks and fissures forming. In this image, the rocks are pulled apart enough that we now have a rift valley. Once that rift valley gets deep enough, it will fill up with water, forming an ocean or a big lake. Eventually, this rock here gets really thin, and eventually the magma will break through and we'll eventually get a mid-ocean ridge. This is an image of a rift valley in Africa. So this line here that is, looks like a mountain, but it's not a mountain. This ridge here is at the same height as the person taking this picture. So down here is where the land has sunken downwards and now has a rift valley. Okay, the last boundary we're going to talk about is convergent boundaries. Convergent is where two plates collide or come together. Now there are three different types of convergent boundaries. We have oceanic continental, where an oceanic and a continental plate collide. We could have an oceanic and a different oceanic plate collide. Or we could have two different continental plates collide. Okay, so let's talk about each of these one at a time. First we have oceanic continental plate. An oceanic plate has a much higher density, so when the oceanic plate and the continental plate collide, the oceanic plate is going to sink down below the continental plate. That's what's going to create what we call a subduction zone. Subduct means to go down below. A subduction zone is going to create a trench in the ocean. As your oceanic plates sink below the continental plate, the oceanic plate's going to eventually melt because of the high temperatures and the high pressures. That melted plate will then rise up because it's less dense since it's hot, and this will create a volcanic mountain. An example of this would be the Andes Mountains in South America. There we have an oceanic plate in the Pacific sinking down below the American plate, and that is forming the Andes mountain range. Okay, if we look at this image, remember the oceanic crust is much thinner than the continental crust. It also has a much higher density, so when these two collide, the oceanic crust is going to sink down, forming a subduction zone. Right here would be the trench. As the plate is sinking, it gets hot, this will melt, it will rise up and forming a mountain. This would be an example of like the Andes Mountains. Okay, the next type we're going to talk about is when two oceanic plates collide. If you have two oceanic plates colliding, they're most likely a different age. Therefore, they're going to have a different temperature and a different density. When it first forms, it's very hot, therefore very low temperature. As it ages, it gets colder and denser. So when these two plates collide, the older, more denser plate will sink below and form another subduction zone. The subduction zone will also have a trench just like the one we just talked about. An example of this would be Japan. This plate boundary will also create volcanic mountains. However, these will be islands instead of on a continent. This is called a volcanic island arc. It is called an arc because they're not in a straight line. They sort of curve in the shape of an arc. Okay, so in this picture we have one oceanic plate here, one oceanic plate here. This must be the older one because it's sinking. It will melt and form volcanoes. Notice it's in a semicircle, it's in an arc. This is your volcanic island arc. Okay, if we take a look at Japan, this is your trench and your subduction zones. These red triangles, they represent the volcanoes. So Japan, you see it's in a semicircle, all form volcanoes next to a trench. Japan is one really large volcanic island arc. Marianas Trench is located off the coast of Japan. This is caused by that subduction zone. This is the deepest part of the ocean. It's about 6.8 miles deep. If you were to go down to the bottom of that trench, you would have 8 tons of pressure per square inch on your body. So just imagine every square inch of your body would have 8 tons of pressure on it. This is why humans can never go down there. Okay, the last type of convergent plate boundary we're going to talk about is the continental plates. So here we have 2 continental plates colliding. Remember, continental plates have a much lower density than oceanic plates, so they won't sink. So if you have 2 continental plates collide, neither of them will sink. So there's nowhere to go but up. So we get really large mountains. These mountains, however, will not be volcanic. Okay? We don't have a plate sinking, so therefore we don't have a plate melting and forming magma to form the volcanoes. So an example of this type of plate boundary would be the Himalayan mountains in Asia. This is where the Indo-Australian plate is colliding with the Eurasian plate. Okay, so India was moving pretty fast relative to the other plate movements. So India is traveling north, and it is hitting the Eurasian plate. So here's the Indian plate moving this way. Some of it is bending downwards, but it's not going to bend down far enough to really melt. So this plate is getting scraped by the Asian plate, and that is what is forming the Himalayan mountains. Here's a fun fact. Over the periods of about 5 to 10 million years, the plates will continue to move about the same rate that they are now. So we can figure in 10 million years, India will plow into Tibet an additional 180 kilometers. This is about the width of Nepal. Because Nepal's boundaries are marked by the Himalayan peaks and the plains of India, Nepal will essentially cease to exist. Okay, so we have plate tectonics. So what? Who cares? Well, humans care because they're responsible for earthquakes, they're responsible for volcanoes, they're responsible for making mountains and trenches. These are some of the Earth's major plates. These are not all of the plates, but these are some of the major ones. Their names seem pretty familiar. African plate is named because Africa's on it. We have the Indian Australia plate because we have India and Australia. Some of the other ones that aren't quite as well known, the Cocos plate here, the Nazca plate, the Scotia plate, and the Arabian plate. This diagram is showing you the direction in which the plates are moving relative to each other. So you see North America is moving towards the northwest, South America is moving mostly east, the Pacific plate's moving northwest. So from these arrows you can figure out what kind of plate boundaries we have. This would be a divergent plate because they're separating. This is a transform plate that we talked about. They're both sort of moving in the northwest, but the Pacific plate is moving much faster, so it's passing the American plate. This was the example of a convergent plate that we talked about. The Nazca plate's coming east, and the South American plate's moving west, and that's forming the Andes Mountains.